Betrayed elderly couple, robbed of everything by their own children, bought a junk Quonset with their last $900, and what it became changed everything. The gavel hit wood like a gunshot. Lot 47, the auctioneer called, voice flat. 3 acres, one quiet condition listed as salvage. A few people chuckled, soft, automatic, like they were laughing at a joke they'd heard before. Matthew Marsh didn't laugh. He didn't blink. He just reached into his coat pocket and felt the hard edges of $900. Every bill folded tight, as if folding it could make it last longer. Olivia sat beside him on a metal chair, her breathing thin and careful. Duke lay at her feet, eyes tracking every stranger in the room like a guard who still believed his post mattered. "Opening bid," the auctioneer said. 500. No one raised a hand. Matthew did. Matthew had seen the property listing in the newspaper 2 weeks ago. He'd driven out to look at it himself, leaving Olivia resting in the RV while Duke rode shotgun in the borrowed church van. What he'd found was exactly what the listing described. 3 acres of overgrown land, anchored by a rusting Quonset hut that looked like it had been forgotten by time and purpose alike. The Quonset was a relic of the post-war era, one of those corrugated steel half-cylinder structures that farmers had once used for everything from grain storage to equipment shelter. This one had been abandoned for at least 20 years, judging by the vegetation growing through its foundation and the rust eating through its panels. To everyone else it was junk. To Matthew, it was a chance. Opening bid at $500, Bert called out, "Do I have 500? Silence. 400. More silence. Someone in the back coughed. 300. Come on, folks. This is 3 acres with a structure. Someone's got to want it. Matthew raised his hand. 300. Heads turned. Bert's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he nodded professionally. 300 to Matthew Marsh. Do I hear 350? The room stayed quiet. Matthew could feel the eyes on him, could hear the whispers starting. He knew what they were thinking. Poor old Matthew lost his mind along with his farm. What's he going to do with a rusted Quonset and 3 acres of weeds? 300 going once, Bert announced. Going twice. 350, a voice called out. Matthew turned to see Jerry Whitmore, who owned the salvage yard on Route 20. The man was smirking, probably figuring he could strip the Quonset for scrap metal and turn a quick profit. 400, Matthew said, his voice steady. Jerry's smirk faded into a calculating squint. 450. Olivia's hand found Matthew's arm. Her grip was light but insistent. They'd agreed on 800 as their maximum, keeping the rest for immediate necessities. Every dollar above that was a dollar they might desperately need. 500, Matthew said. The whispers grew louder. Someone, Matthew thought it might be Carl Hendris, whose dairy farm bordered the Marsh property before the sale, muttered something about throwing good money after bad. Jerry Whitmore studied Matthew for a long moment, then shook his head. Too rich for my blood. You want that rust heap, it's yours. 500 to Matthew Marsh, Bert confirmed. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the room. Sold. The paperwork took less than 20 minutes. Matthew signed his name in the spaces Bert indicated, handed over $500 in cash, and received a key that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The deed would be filed with the county within the week. As they walked out of the auction house into the pale March sunlight, Duke pressed close to Olivia's side, his ears rotating to catch every sound. Matthew could feel the weight of amused pity following them from the building. Matthew Marsh, someone said behind him. Carl Hendris, confirming Matthew's earlier guess. What in God's name are you going to do with that worthless piece of land? Matthew didn't turn around. Live on it. The laughter that followed them to the church van was the kind that expects to be proven right. The drive to Mill Creek Road took them through the heart of Cedar Falls. Past the hardware store where Matthew had bought supplies for 60 years. Past the diner where he and Olivia had eaten breakfast every Saturday morning. Past the bank that had foreclosed on neighbors during the farm crisis of the 80s. Neighbors Matthew had helped feed and clothe until they got back on their feet. No one had offered to help the Marshes. "You're quiet," Olivia said from the passenger seat. Duke lay across her lap, his head resting on the armrest, watching the familiar streets slide by. "Just thinking about what people said." Matthew glanced at his wife. Even at 79, with her health not what it used to be, Olivia had a way of seeing straight through him. She'd been doing it since they were 17 years old, and he tried to convince her that he didn't care whether she went to the harvest dance with Billy Morrison. "Doesn't matter what they say." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't, but it still hurts." Matthew reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were thinner than they used to be, the skin papery and spotted with age, but her grip was still strong. "I'm going to build us something, Evie. I don't know exactly what yet, but I'm going to build us a place to live, a place that's ours, and I'm going to do it with whatever we've got left. That's $414, and a Quonset held together by rust and prayers. And you," Matthew said. "And Duke, that's not nothing." Duke's tail thumped against the seat at the sound of his name. They arrived at the property just as the afternoon light began to soften. Matthew had prepared himself for disappointment, had steeled himself to see the same discouraging sight that had made everyone else laugh. But something was different this time. As he stepped out of the van and walked toward the Quonset, Duke jumped down and immediately began circling the perimeter, nose to the ground, tail held level with his back. The posture of a dog, investigating something important. The structure rose from the overgrown land like a sleeping giant. Its curved steel panels strained with rust, the color of dried blood. Weeds had pushed through cracks in the concrete pad that served as its floor. The main door, a massive sliding panel on rusted tracks, stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within. Matthew approached slowly, aware of Olivia picking her way through the tall grass behind him, her hand trailing along Duke's back for balance. "It's bigger than I remembered," she said. She was right. From the auction listing, Matthew had estimated the Quonset at roughly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. Standing before it now, he revised that estimate upward, 50 feet at least, maybe more. He reached the door and placed his palm flat against the metal. It was cold, even in the March sunshine, and he could feel the rough texture of corrosion beneath his fingers. But when he pushed, the door moved more easily than he'd expected, sliding back on its track with a groan that echoed across the empty land. Light fell into the interior in a golden shaft, illuminating what had been hidden for decades. Matthew's breath caught. The Quonset was not empty. Against the far wall, draped in canvas tarps, now grey with dust, stood shapes that Matthew's 60 years of farming immediately recognized. Equipment, machinery, the outlines of what might be a tractor, a hay baler, various implements stacked and stored with the precision of someone who understood their value. "Matthew," Olivia whispered. "Is that equipment?" he confirmed. "Old by the looks of it, but equipment." Duke had pushed past Matthew's legs into the interior, his nails clicking on the concrete as he investigated. The dog moved with purpose, not the random wandering of simple curiosity. He went directly to a corner of the Quonset, where shelving units stood in shadow, then sat and looked back at Matthew with an expression of alert expectation, the same way he'd sat when he'd found the breach in the north fence line last year. The same way he'd indicated the day he'd led Matthew to a newborn calf that had wandered from its mother during a spring storm. Duke had found something. Matthew followed the dog, picking his way carefully around the shrouded equipment. The shelving unit was industrial heavy-duty steel, bolted to the Quonset's wall. Its shelves were stacked with boxes, cans and containers that defied immediate identification in the dim light. But it was what sat on the bottom shelf that made Matthew stop. A metal box about the size of a small suitcase, secured with a padlock that had long since rusted open. The box itself was army green, the kind of surplus container that had been common in the years after World War II. Stenciled on its side, barely visible beneath decades of dust, were initials ETM. Matthew knew those initials. ETM. Edgar Thomas Marsh, his father, Evie, Matthew said, his voice strange even to his own ears. Come look at this. The box contained secrets that had been waiting 70 years to be found. Matthew carried it outside into the fading light, set it on the tailgate of the van, and carefully lifted the lid. Duke sat at his feet, watching with an intensity that made Matthew wonder what the dog could sense that human senses couldn't detect. Inside, preserved by the sealed container and the cool, dry environment of the Quonset, lay a collection of items that told a story Matthew had never known. On top was a leather journal, its cover cracked but intact. Beneath that, a stack of photographs held together with a rubber band that crumbled at Matthew's touch. Official-looking documents in manila folders, a pocket watch with a stopped face, and at the very bottom, a hand-drawn map with annotations in handwriting Matthew recognized as his father's. "Your father never mentioned any of this?" Olivia asked, standing at his shoulder. "Dad never talked about the years before he married." "Mom," said the past was past. Edgar Thomas Marsh had been a man of few words and fewer explanations. He'd returned from World War II, bought the farm in Cedar Falls, and worked it until his heart gave out in 1978. Matthew had been 41 years old when he buried his father, and he'd thought he knew everything important about the man. He was wrong. Matthew opened the journal carefully, aware that the pages might be fragile. The first entry was dated August 1946. "I found a place to start over. 3 acres on Mill Creek Road, with a Quonset I can convert to storage. Nobody knows about the money yet, and I aim to keep it that way until I'm sure who I can trust. The farm is the priority. Everything else can wait. Money." Matthew turned to Olivia. "He talks about money, something he was hiding. Keep reading." The journal entries spanned nearly 2 years detailing Edgar's purchase of the Mill Creek property, which Matthew now realized his father had secretly owned alongside the main farm. His careful stockpiling of equipment and supplies and cryptic references to the account and the arrangement. One entry dated March 1, 1948, made Matthew's hands tremble. "The banker in Des Moines says the certificates have matured nicely. I've added the Mill Creek deed to the deposit box. Someday, when the time is right, this will all go to whoever needs it most. I've seen what happens when families fight over money. Better to let it wait until it finds the right hands." Matthew looked at Duke, who was still watching him with those knowing amber eyes. "He left something behind," Matthew said slowly. "Dad bought this property separate from the farm. He stored equipment here, supplies, and something in Des Moines, some kind of certificates, investments maybe, and no one knew, no one, not Mom, not me. He kept it completely separate." Olivia's hand found his arm again. "Matthew, the children. When Robert did all that financial maneuvering, the farm was all anyone knew about." Matthew finished. "This property, whatever's in Des Moines, Robert couldn't have touched it because Robert didn't know it existed." The implications settled over Matthew like a warm blanket on a cold night. For the first time in 3 months, he felt something that had abandoned him on the day he'd watched strangers drive away with his grandfather's tools. Hope. But it was fragile hope, uncertain hope. Whatever Edgar Marsh had left behind might amount to nothing. Worthless certificates in a defunct bank, a storage unit of rusted equipment. The journal was 70 years old. Wars had been fought, economies had collapsed, institutions had failed. Still, Matthew stood a little straighter as the sun dipped toward the horizon. He looked at the Quonset, really looked at it, and began to see what it might become instead of what it currently was. "We'll need to make it livable first," he said, thinking out loud. "The structures sound underneath the rust. Quonsets are built to last. Insulation, electrical, plumbing. We can do it in stages. Ah, Matthew, we have $400. We have $400. This land, this building." And he held up the journal. "A mystery to solve. That's more than we had yesterday." Duke rose from his sitting position and walked to the Quonset's open door. He stood in the threshold, looking back at Matthew and Olivia, then stepped inside, disappearing into the shadows. A moment later, his bark echoed from the interior. Not an alarm bark, but the sound he made when he wanted Matthew to come see something. That dog, Olivia said with a small smile, has been finding things we couldn't see our whole lives. Matthew helped her across the uneven ground to the Quonset's entrance. Inside, Duke stood beside one of the canvas-draped shapes. Pawing at the covering, Matthew pulled back the tarp. Beneath it, preserved in the darkness for God knows how long, sat a 1947 Farmall Model M tractor. Red paint faded but intact. Tires flat but repairable. Engine that had probably turned over last when Harry Truman was president. But that wasn't what made Matthew's throat tighten. Tied to the steering wheel with a piece of twine that had somehow survived the decades was a note handwritten on paper, now yellow with age iris, for those who don't give up on it. Dad Matthew read the words 3 times before he trusted himself to speak. He knew, Matthew whispered somehow. He knew. Olivia stood beside him, her arm around his waist, Duke pressing against both their legs. Knew what? Matthew looked at the tractor, at the equipment surrounding it, at the Quonset that everyone had laughed at and his father had secretly prepared. That someday I'd need a place to start over. Outside the sun finished its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The Quonset's curved roof caught the light, and for just a moment glowed like something precious, instead of something forgotten. Now Matthew and Olivia had a mystery to solve, and a future to build. But the road ahead was about to get much more complicated than either of them expected, because they weren't the only ones who had heard about the Marsh family's misfortune, and they weren't the only ones now wondering what secrets Edgar Marsh had left behind. The first night they spent on the Mill Creek property, Matthew and Olivia slept in the church van with Duke wedged between them, his body heat a blessing against the March cold. The Quonset stood 30 yards away, its dark bulk visible through the van's windows, keeping watch like a faithful sentinel. Matthew barely slept. His mind kept returning to his father's journal, to the careful handwriting that spelled out secrets Edgar Marsh had carried to his grave. What kind of man hides an entire property from his family? What kind of father leaves a message tied to a tractor steering wheel, addressed to a son who might never find it? The answer Matthew was beginning to understand was a man who had learned not to trust easily. A man who had seen what money could do to people, how it could twist love into something unrecognizable. Edgar Marsh had been protecting his son from the very fate that had eventually found him. Anyway, at first light, Matthew eased out of the van, careful not to wake Olivia. Duke lifted his head, amber eyes questioning, but Matthew gestured for him to stay. The dog settled back down, though his gaze followed Matthew through the window. The morning air carried the sharp bite of late winter, but there was something else beneath it, the faint green smell of things preparing to grow. Spring was coming, whether the calendar acknowledged it or not. Matthew walked the perimeter of the property, really seeing it for the first time. 3 acres didn't sound like much, not compared to the 200 acres he'd lost. But as he paced the boundaries, he began to understand why his father had chosen this particular piece of land. The topography was gentle, sloping slightly toward a creek that ran along the eastern edge. The soil visible where winter had killed back the vegetation was dark and rich, bottomland that would grow anything you asked it to. A stand of mature oaks clustered near the northwest corner, providing natural windbreak and future firewood, and the Quonset itself sat on the highest point, safe from any flooding the creek might bring. Edgar Marsh hadn't bought junk. He'd bought potential and then hidden it in plain sight. By the time Matthew returned to the van, Olivia was awake and had managed to coax their small camp stove to life. The smell of coffee, weak, made from grounds they'd already used twice, cut through the morning chill. "You were walking the land," she said. It wasn't a question. Dad knew what he was doing. "This property, it's good land, Libby, really good." She handed him a cup. "So, what's the plan?" Matthew had been thinking about that all night. First, we need to make the Quonset livable. Basic shelter, somewhere we can sleep that isn't this van. Second, we need to get to Des Moines, find out what Dad left in that deposit box. Des Moines is 150 miles away. That's gas money we don't have. I know. That's why we start with the Quonset. Maybe some of that equipment Dad stored is worth something. Maybe we can sell enough to fund the trip. Duke emerged from the van, stretching luxuriously, before patting over to press against Matthew's leg. The dog looked toward the Quonset, then back at Matthew, his message clear. He wants to show us something else, Olivia observed. He always does. The morning light transformed the Quonset's interior from a cave of shadows into something that approached wonder. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the corrugated panels, creating shafts of gold that illuminated decades of carefully stored provisions. Matthew had only scratched the surface the day before. Now, with Olivia beside him and Duke ranging through the space like a general inspecting his troops, the full scope of Edgar Marsh's preparation became clear. There was the tractor, of course, the 1947 Farmall that had somehow known Matthew would need it. But surrounding it, stacked and organized with military precision, was equipment that spanned decades of agricultural innovation. A hay baler from the early 50s, still bearing traces of the green paint that marked it as a John Deere, a disc harrow with blades that would need sharpening but showed no signs of structural damage, hand tools hung on pegboard along one wall, wrenches, hammers, saws, levels, each one outlined in paint so you'd know immediately if something was missing. And on the industrial shelving that Duke had led Matthew to the day before, supplies that beggared belief, cans of preserved food, their labels faded but seals intact, rolls of copper wire, boxes of nails and screws sorted by size, kerosene lanterns with full reservoirs, wool blankets still wrapped in paper that crinkled when Matthew touched it. He was preparing for something, Olivia said softly, like he expected the world to fall apart. Matthew nodded. His father had returned from World War II, a changed man. Everyone said so. The laughing boy who'd left Cedar Falls in 1942 had come back quiet, watchful, prone to staring at horizons, like he expected enemies to appear there. I think he just wanted to make sure someone in the family could survive no matter what happened. Duke barked once sharply, and both of them turned. The dog stood at the far end of the Quonset, near a section of wall that was partially obscured by stacked wooden crates. His posture was the same alert stance he'd shown the day before, the indication that something important lay hidden. Matthew approached, Olivia following more slowly. Her breathing labored from the dust and exertion. The crates were heavy, filled with God knew what. But Matthew managed to shift them enough to reveal what Duke had found. A door, not a main entrance. The Quonset's only obvious door was the large sliding panel at the front. This was smaller, human-sized, set into a frame that had been welded directly to the curved steel wall. It was padlocked, but the lock was the same brand as the one on the metal box, rusted, ancient, and easily defeated by the bolt cutters Matthew found hanging on the tool wall. The door opened onto darkness, and a smell that made Matthew's stomach clench with unexpected memory. Earth and concrete, motor oil and old paper. The specific perfume of a root cellar of underground spaces where time moved differently. There's a cellar, he said, disbelief coloring his voice. Dad built a cellar under the Quonset. Duke descended the concrete steps without hesitation, his nails clicking in the blackness below. Matthew found one of the kerosene lanterns, lit it with matches that had somehow remained viable across the decades, and followed. The cellar was perhaps 30 feet square, with poured concrete walls and a floor that was cold even through Matthew's worn boots. Shelving lined every wall, stacked with more supplies, but these were different, more personal. Boxes labeled photos, letters, army records, a trunk with Edgar's name stenciled on the side, the same trunk that had accompanied him to Europe and back. And in the center of the space, on a small wooden table, another metal box. This one newer than the first, its lock still shiny, despite the underground humidity. Matthew's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a letter addressed to him directly. The handwriting was his father's, but shakier than the journal entries. This had been written later, perhaps much later. Matthew, if you're reading this, then things went bad enough that you had to find your way here. I'm sorry for that. I always hoped the main farm would be enough, that you'd never need what I've stored on Mill Creek. The certificates I mentioned in my journal are in a safety deposit box at First Federal Bank of Des Moines, box number 443. The key is taped to the bottom of this box. The bank may have changed hands over the years, but the box was paid up through 2020. After that, I don't know what happens. There's also a letter in the box for whoever's running the bank. It explains everything and authorizes you to claim the contents. I should have told you about all this while I was alive. I should have trusted you, but I saw too many families torn apart by inheritance, by money, by the poison of expecting something you didn't earn. I wanted you to build your own life, to know that everything you had came from your own hands. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should have prepared you better. All I can do now is leave you what I can and hope it's enough. The land provides for those who don't give up on it. I meant that when I wrote it, and I mean it now. Whatever happened to bring you here, don't let it break you. You come from people who survived worse. You have your mother's faith and my stubbornness, and that combination can weather any storm. I love you, son. I should have said it more when I had the chance. Dad. Matthew read the letter 3 times before he realized tears were streaming down his face. Olivia had descended the stairs behind him, her hand finding his shoulder in the lamplight. He loved you, she said simply. He just didn't know how to show it the way you needed. He knew, Matthew managed. Somehow he knew this would happen. No, Olivia's voice was gentle but firm. He didn't know specifically. He just understood that life can take everything from you without warning. So he prepared. He gave you a safety net you didn't know you had. Duke had been exploring the cellar's perimeter, sniffing at boxes and shelves with methodical interest. Now he returned to Matthew's side and pressed his head against Matthew's thigh, the dog's way of offering comfort. Matthew reached down and scratched behind Duke's ears. "Okay," he said, his voice steadying. "Okay, Des Moines. We need to get to Des Moines." The key, as promised, was taped to the bottom of the metal box. Matthew held it up to the lantern light, a small brass key, the kind used for safety deposit boxes, still bright despite its years in darkness. But Des Moines was still 150 miles away, and their remaining $400 needed to stretch further than any money had a right to stretch. The next week became an exercise in triage. Matthew worked from dawn until his body wouldn't let him work anymore, sorting through the Quonset's contents with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent 60 years knowing exactly what farm equipment was worth. Most of what Edgar had stored was too old to have significant value. Antique dealers might pay something for the farm all eventually, but that would take time and connections Matthew didn't have. What he did find buried under tarps in a corner he hadn't fully explored were 3 50-gallon drums of diesel fuel. The drums were sealed, the fuel preserved with stabilizer, and when Matthew tested a small sample in the van's engine, it ran clean. Diesel was going for $4 a gallon in Cedar Falls. That's $600, Olivia calculated when he told her. If someone will buy it, Oliver Jensen will buy it. The name landed between them with complicated weight. Oliver Jensen owned the feed store in Cedar Falls, had owned it for 40 years. He'd been a friend once, back when the Marsh farm was prosperous, and Matthew's name meant something. Since the eviction, Oliver had been one of the many former friends who'd suddenly found themselves too busy for conversation. "You think he'll deal with you?" "Oliver Jensen is a businessman. He'll deal with anyone if the price is right." Matthew drove into Cedar Falls alone, leaving Olivia and Duke at the property. The van's engine complained about the cold, but turned over reliably, and Matthew found himself grateful for small mercies. The feed store looked exactly as it had for decades. Red paint, white trim, a wooden sign that Oliver's father had carved in 1952. The parking lot held a handful of trucks, farmers getting an early start on spring preparation. Matthew walked through the front door, and the conversation near the register died like a candle in a windstorm. Oliver Jensen looked up from his paperwork. He was Matthew's age, give or take, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. His expression, when he saw who had entered, cycled through surprise, discomfort, and finally settled on something carefully neutral. Matthew Oliver. The silence stretched. Other customers found reasons to examine merchandise on distant shelves. "I have diesel to sell," Matthew said, seeing no point in pretense. 350-gallon drums, stabilized, tests clean. "I'm asking $3.50 a gallon." Oliver's eyes narrowed. The calculation of a man who'd been negotiating deals since before either of them had grey hair. "That's below market. I know. I need the money quickly, and I don't have time to find retail buyers. Where'd you get 3 drums of diesel?" "My property." Your Oliver stopped himself. "I heard about the auction that Quonset on Mill Creek Road." "That's right." Something shifted in Oliver's face. Not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to it. "People are talking, Matthew, saying, you've lost your mind buying that rusted heap. People have been wrong about me before." Oliver studied him for a long moment. Then he did something Matthew hadn't expected. He came around the counter and extended his hand. "I'm sorry," Oliver said quietly, "about everything. What your kids did, how the town's treated you. It's not right." Matthew shook the offered hand, surprised by the emotion that tightened his throat. "Thank you. I'll take the diesel. $3.50 a gallon cash. I'll pick it up tomorrow, if you can give me directions to the property." "I can do that." The transaction was completed in minutes. A handshake, an agreement, directions scrolled on the back of a receipt. As Matthew turned to leave, Oliver's voice stopped him. "Matthew, whatever you're building out there on Mill Creek Road, I hope it works out. Some of us remember what your family used to mean to this town. Some of us are rooting for you, even if we haven't said so." Matthew nodded, not trusting his voice, and walked out into the thin March sunshine. The diesel money, $525, changed everything. Combined with what they had left, Matthew and Olivia now had nearly $900 again. Enough for gas to Des Moines and back, with money to spare. Enough to buy basic supplies for making the Quonset livable. Enough to breathe without the constant pressure of imminent catastrophe. Oliver Jensen arrived the next morning as promised, bringing not just his truck for the diesel drums, but also something he called a loan that doesn't need paying back, a space heater that ran on propane along with 2 full tanks. "My wife cleaned out the garage," Oliver explained gruffly when Matthew tried to protest. "She was going to donate it anyway. Might as well go somewhere useful." That night, for the first time, Matthew and Olivia slept inside the Quonset itself, on camp beds made from the preserved wool blankets arranged over wooden pallets. The space heater pushed back the cold, and Duke curled at the foot of their makeshift bed, his presence more comforting than any locked door. "Tomorrow," Olivia said in the darkness. "Des Moines, are you up for the drive?" "I've been feeling stronger," she paused. "The spring water from the creek, there's something about it. Ever since I started drinking it, my chest feels clearer." Matthew had noticed the same thing. Olivia's breathing, which had been labored for years, a combination of age and the lung damage she'd suffered working in the textile mill during the 70s, seemed easier since they'd moved to Mill Creek Road. He'd attributed it to the clean air, the removal from the stress of their situation. But now, lying in darkness, he thought about his father's letter. The land provides for those who don't give up on it. Maybe Edgar Marsh had known something about this property that went beyond simple real estate value. Maybe there was a reason he'd chosen these 3 acres out of all the land available in Iowa. Duke shifted at the foot of the bed, letting out a soft woof of contentment. Whatever mysteries remained, the dog seemed to approve of their current situation. Before we continue with Matthew and Olivia's journey to Des Moines, I want to pause and say thank you for being here. If this story is resonating with you, I'd love it if you'd hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know, and it means we can keep sharing stories like this one. Now, where were we? Ah yes, Des Moines. They left at dawn. Duke riding in the back seat of the van with his head resting on the center console, positioned so he could watch both Matthew and Olivia simultaneously. The highway stretched westward, through farmland that was just beginning to shake off winter's grip. Fields still brown but with a hint of green pushing through. Matthew had called ahead to First Federal Bank, or rather to what First Federal had become after 3 mergers and 2 name changes. The current institution, Prairie Trust Financial, had records of Safety Deposit Box 443, and after considerable hold time and transfers between departments, a manager named Susan Chen had confirmed that yes, the box was still active, and yes, the original rental agreement appeared to have been paid through 2020, with automatic renewals tied to an account that had since been closed. The box is technically in arrears, Susan had explained on the phone. We've been trying to contact the account holder for several years. If you have documentation proving you're the authorized heir, we should be able to resolve this. Matthew had documentation, his father's letter, the key, and his own identification that proved he was Edgar Thomas Marsh's only surviving child. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. The drive took 3 hours through increasingly urban landscape. Des Moines rose from the prairie like a sudden assertion, all glass and steel and traffic that seemed chaotic after months in the quiet of Cedar Falls. Prairie Trust Financial occupied the ground floor of a building that had probably been impressive in the 1980s, but now wore its age with diminishing grace. Matthew found parking 2 blocks away and helped Olivia out of the van, Duke's leash wrapped firmly around his wrist. They might not let him inside, Olivia worried. Then I'll wait with him while you handle the bank. But Susan Chen, when she emerged from her office to greet them, took one look at Duke and smiled. Is he a service dog? He's a farm dog, Matthew said. Best friend I've ever had. Susan's smile widened. We have a policy about service animals, but we don't have a policy about best friends. As long as he's well behaved, he's welcome. Duke, as if understanding the stakes, adopted his most dignified posture and walked beside Matthew with the bearing of a dog who had been attending important meetings his entire life. The safety deposit box vault was in the basement behind a door that required Susan's keycard and a 6-digit code. The room beyond was lined with metal boxes of various sizes, numbered and labeled with the impersonal efficiency of a filing system. Box 443 was in the bottom row, larger than Matthew had expected, perhaps 18 inches long and a foot deep. I'll need to see your documentation, Susan said, and then I'll give you privacy to examine the contents. Matthew handed over everything, his driver's license, his father's letter, the key, a copy of Edgar's death certificate that he'd retrieved from county records years ago. Susan examined each document carefully, making notes on a tablet computer. This all appears to be in order, she said. Finally, there's the matter of the back rent on the box. It's been accruing since 2020, which amounts to roughly $240. Matthew's heart sank. They had the money, but barely. However, Susan continued, given the circumstances and the length of time this box has been with our institution and its predecessors, I'm authorized to waive that fee. Consider it a courtesy to a long-standing customer. Thank you, Matthew managed. You have no idea what that means. Susan inserted her master key alongside Matthew's, and the box slid free. She placed it on a viewing table, nodded to Matthew and Olivia, and left them alone. Duke sat at Matthew's feet, ears forward, watching as Matthew lifted the lid. Inside was exactly what his father's letter had promised, and more. Stock certificates bundled in rubber bands that had long since perished, but were held together by the pressure of the box itself. Bearer bonds in denominations that made Matthew's vision blur. A savings account passbook from First Federal Bank of Des Moines, showing a balance from $1,985 of $47,000, with a note that the account had been converted to a CD and rolled over annually. And beneath all the financial instruments, one final letter. This one in a different hand, feminine, elegant, written on paper that smelled faintly of flowers, even after decades in darkness. My darling Matthew, if you're reading this, then your father's plan worked, and you found your way here when you needed to. I want you to know that this was our idea together, mine and your father's. We both knew what money could do to families, how it could poison even the strongest bonds. The certificates and bonds are real, and they're yours. Your father invested carefully for 30 years, and the returns were better than either of us expected. The savings account should still be active, though I imagine the bank has changed hands more than once since I wrote this. Use what's here to build something good. Use it to help people who need help. Use it to remember that wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you do with it. I loved you from the moment you were born, and I will love you until the stars go dark. Your father wasn't good at saying such things, but I know he felt the same. Be happy, my son. That's all we ever wanted for you. With all my love, Mum. Matthew sat heavily in the chair Susan had provided. His mother had died in 1992, 16 years after his father. She'd never mentioned any of this, not the property, not the investments, not the safety deposit box in Des Moines. They had kept their secret together, and they had trusted that secret to time and providence and the hope that their son would never need it. But if he did need it, if everything else fell apart, it would be waiting. Olivia's hand found his shoulder. How much? She asked quietly. Matthew looked at the certificates, the bonds, the passbook. He wasn't a financial expert, but he could read numbers. I don't know exactly. Some of these would need to be assessed, verified, but if they're worth what they appear to be worth. He stopped, unable to say it. Tell me. Hundreds of thousands, Libby. Maybe more. Duke wed softly and pressed against Matthew's leg. The dog could sense the emotional storm building, the collision of grief and relief, and something that felt dangerously like hope. We're not broke, Matthew whispered. We were never really broke. We just didn't know it yet. Olivia pulled him into an embrace, her thin arms surprisingly strong. Your parents loved you, she said. They loved you enough to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. That's the greatest gift anyone can give. They held each other in the basement vault of a Des Moines bank, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had outlasted death, guided by the instincts of an old dog who somehow always knew where to find what was hidden. When they finally emerged into the spring sunlight, Matthew carried a box full of documents and a heart full of something he hadn't felt in months. Purpose. The future wasn't certain. Nothing ever was. The certificates might be worth less than they appeared. The bank accounts might have been seized or forgotten or lost to bureaucratic incompetence. Robert and Patricia and Michael might appear from nowhere to claim a share of an inheritance they didn't know existed. But whatever happened next, Matthew and Olivia weren't starting from nothing anymore. They had land, they had shelter, they had each other, and Duke, and a legacy of love that had been waiting patiently for 70 years. And they had a rusted Quonset on Mill Creek Road that was about to become something nobody in Cedar Falls had ever imagined. The drive back from Des Moines felt different than the drive there. Matthew kept glancing at the box of documents on the seat beside Olivia, half expecting it to vanish like a dream upon waking. Duke had positioned himself so his chin rested on the box's edge, as if he understood its importance, and had appointed himself guardian. "We should find a lawyer," Olivia said as they crossed back into familiar Iowa farmland. "Someone who can help us understand what we actually have." "I know someone," Tom Redhawk handled some business for the farm years ago. "Good man, honest. Will he see us after everything?" Matthew considered the question. Tom Redhawk had sent a card after the eviction, a simple note that said, "I'm sorry this happened to you," without excuses or explanations. It wasn't much, but it was more than most had offered. "I think he will." They arrived back at Mill Creek Road as the sun began its descent, painting the Quonset in shades of amber that almost disguised its rust. Duke bounded from the van the moment the door opened. immediately beginning his perimeter check with the seriousness of a soldier returning to post. That night, Matthew couldn't sleep. He sat outside on an overturned crate wrapped in one of his father's preserved wool blankets, watching stars emerge in a sky unpolluted by city lights. The creek murmured in the darkness, and somewhere an owl called out its hunting song. 81 years old, he'd lived through wars and recessions and personal losses that had threatened to break him. He'd buried his parents, watched his children grow into strangers, lost a farm that had been in his family for a century. And yet here he was starting over. The absurdity of it struck him suddenly, and he laughed, a rusty sound that startled Duke into alertness. "It's okay, boy," Matthew said, reaching down to scratch the dog's ears. "I'm just realizing that life doesn't stop surprising you no matter how old you get." Duke settled back down, but kept his eyes on Matthew as if monitoring him for further signs of instability. Tom Redhawk's office occupied the second floor of a brick building on Main Street in Cedar Falls, above a bakery that filled the stairwell with the smell of fresh bread. The lawyer himself was a compact man in his 60s, with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that missed nothing. Matthew Olivia. He rose from behind his desk, genuine warmth in his voice. "I was hoping I'd hear from you. Please sit down." The office was cluttered with files and books, but there was order beneath the chaos. The organized mind of someone who knew exactly where everything was despite appearances. Duke, who had been allowed inside with a raised eyebrow and a small smile from Tom, settled at Matthew's feet. "I need help understanding what we have," Matthew said, placing the box of documents on Tom's desk. "My father left these in a safety deposit box in Des Moines. We just retrieved them yesterday." Tom's eyebrows climbed as he began examining the contents. Stock certificates, bearer bonds, the savings passbook, the letters from both of Matthew's parents. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to his reading glasses. "Please." The silence stretched as Tom worked through the documents, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, sometimes pausing to examine a certificate more closely. Duke watched him with the same attention he'd give a rabbit in the garden. Alert but patient, after nearly an hour, Tom set down his glasses and leaned back in his chair. "Matthew, I need to make some calls to verify everything, but based on what I'm seeing here," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your father was a very smart investor. These stock certificates, some of them are for companies that no longer exist, but several were acquired by larger corporations over the years. The shares would have converted, and based on the original quantities." "How much?" Tom met his eyes. "Conservatively, the stocks alone could be worth $300,000 to $400,000. The bearer bonds, if they're still valid, and I'll need to check that, add another $50,000 to $75,000. The savings account with compound interest over 40 years. He shook his head. "We're potentially looking at over $500,000 in total assets, Matthew. Maybe more." Olivia's hand found Matthew's arm, gripping tight. "That can't be right," Matthew said. "My father was a farmer. He never had that kind of money. He had time," Tom said simply, "and patience. These investments started in the 50s from what I can see. 60-plus years of compound growth, dividends, reinvested, stock splits." He spread his hands. "Time is the most powerful force in finance. Your father understood that." Duke wed softly, sensing the emotional charge in the room. Matthew reached down to rest his hand on the dog's head, grounding himself in the familiar warmth of fur and loyalty. "What do we need to do? Let me make those calls. Verify everything. It'll take a few days, maybe a week. In the meantime, I'd recommend keeping this information private. Once word gets out that you've come into money," he didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew who would come calling. The week that followed was one of the strangest in Matthew's long life. On the surface, nothing had changed. He and Olivia still lived in the Quonset, still slept on makeshift beds, still heated water on the camp stove for washing. Duke still made his rounds each morning and evening, still led Matthew to things hidden in corners and beneath tarps that he'd somehow missed before. But beneath the surface, Everything was different. The weight that had pressed down on Matthew's chest since the eviction had lifted, replaced by something that felt dangerously like anticipation. He threw himself into work with an energy that surprised even himself. The Quonset's main door, which had been grinding on its track, was repaired with parts scavenged from the equipment his father had stored. The gaps in the corrugated panels were patched with metal sheeting that Oliver Jensen delivered one afternoon, waving off Matthew's attempts to pay. "Call it a loan," Oliver said. "You can make it up to me later when you're back on your feet." The feed store owner had become an unexpected ally. Word had spread through Cedar Falls about the Marshes buying the worthless Mill Creek property, and the laughter that had followed them from the auction had begun to quiet. All, it seemed, had been telling people to reserve judgment. "He's Matthew Marsh," Oliver reportedly said when someone mocked the purchase. "I've known him 60 years. If he sees something in that land, there's something there to see." Matthew didn't know how to feel about being defended. For 3 months he'd grown accustomed to being invisible, to being dismissed. Having someone speak up for him felt like a gift he hadn't earned. "You earned it," Olivia told him when he mentioned it. "You earned it by being the kind of man people remember when things get hard. Oliver is not doing you a favor. He's repaying a debt you probably don't even remember creating." She was right, of course. Over the decades, Matthew had helped neighbors through hard times more often than he could count. Equipment loans, emergency hay deliveries, simply showing up when hands were needed. He'd never kept track, never expected anything in return. Maybe that was the point. Tom Redhawk called on a Thursday, exactly 8 days after their meeting. "It's real," he said without preamble. "All of it. The stocks are worth even more than I initially estimated. Several of the companies have done exceptionally well in recent years. The bearer bonds are valid and can be cashed. The savings account exists and has been accruing interest in a successor institution. Matthew, you're looking at roughly $620,000 in liquid assets." Matthew sat down heavily on an overturned bucket, the phone pressed to his ear. Duke, sensing something significant, abandoned his exploration of the cellar entrance and came to sit beside him. $620,000, give or take. There'll be taxes, of course, but your basis in the investments is so old that the rates will be favorable. You could net $500,000 after everything is settled. $500,000. More money than Matthew had ever had at one time in his life, more than the farm had been worth, more than everything Robert had stolen and squandered. "What do I need to do?" "Come into the office tomorrow. We'll start the paperwork to liquidate what needs liquidating and transfer everything into accounts in your name." I'd also recommend. Tom paused. "Matthew, I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from someone else." The lawyer's tone had shifted, taking on an edge that made Matthew's stomach tighten. "What is it?" "Robert has been calling around town. He heard somehow that you've been working on the Mill Creek property, that you found things there. He's been asking questions about your legal status, about inheritance laws, about whether assets discovered on property you own are subject to claims from family members." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of cold anger through Matthew's chest. "He's going to try to take it." "He's going to try something," Tom agreed. "I don't know what exactly, but I wanted you to be prepared. Everything your father left you is legally yours. The property was in his name. The investments were in his name. And you're his only heir. But that doesn't mean Robert won't make noise." Duke growled softly as if he could hear Robert's name through the phone and understood what it meant. "Let him come," Matthew said, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. "Let him try." Now, the confrontation that had been building since the eviction was about to arrive. But first, there was work to be done. Spring arrived in earnest during the 3rd week of April, and with it came a transformation that Matthew couldn't have imagined when he'd first stood before the rusted Quonset with nothing but a key and a desperate hope. The main structure was now weather-tight, its gaps sealed, its door operating smoothly on newly greased tracks. Matthew had partitioned the interior into distinct spaces, a living area with the camp beds replaced by a proper mattress on a frame built from salvaged lumber, a kitchen corner with a real propane stove, and a sink that drained to a grey water system, and a workshop where the antique equipment waited for restoration. The cellar had become their storage space, its natural cool temperature, perfect for preserving food. Olivia had discovered that Edgar's carefully sealed cans were still edible, decades-old green beans and corn that tasted of history but provided nourishment. More significant was what was happening outside. The 3 acres, which had been choked with weeds and volunteer saplings when they'd arrived, were slowly being reclaimed. Matthew worked for hours each day clearing brush, turning soil, rediscovering the contours of land his father had once cultivated. Duke worked alongside him, investigating each newly cleared section as if approving the progress. "You're going to hurt yourself," Olivia warned one evening as Matthew limped back to the Quonset, his back aching from a day of digging post holes. "I've been hurting myself for 81 years, he replied. "Hasn't killed me yet, but she was right to worry." Matthew was pushing himself harder than he had in decades, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Part of it was practical. There was genuinely work that needed doing, but part of it was something else. Something that felt like reclamation, like taking back what had been stolen. Every fence post he set, every weed he pulled, every improvement he made to the Quonset was a declaration. "I am not finished. I am not broken. I am still here." Duke seemed to understand. The dog stayed close during the work hours, sometimes helping by dragging branches to the burn pile, sometimes simply lying nearby in a patch of sun. His presence a steady reminder that Matthew wasn't alone in this enterprise. One afternoon, as Matthew was attempting to repair the farmall's fuel system, Duke suddenly stood at attention, his gaze fixed on the access road that led from the main highway to their property. A car was approaching, a sleek, dark sedan entirely out of place on the rutted gravel track. Matthew wiped his hands on a rag and waited. The sedan parked and Robert stepped out. Matthew hadn't seen his eldest son in over a year. Not since the day Robert had handed over the nursing home pamphlet and dismissed Ranger as a disposal problem. The man who emerged from the car looked prosperous, despite having lost most of his client's money. Dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Matthew's entire wardrobe. "Dad," Robert's voice carried across the clearing, pitched in that tone of reasonable concern that Matthew had learned to distrust. "We need to talk." Duke's growl was low and continuous, a rumble of warning that Matthew felt rather than heard. He placed a hand on the dog's back, but didn't restrain him. "So, talk." Robert approached, his polished shoes immediately collecting dust from the unpaved ground. He looked at the Quonset, at the cleared land, at the evidence of weeks of labor, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "I heard you've been making progress out here. That's good, Dad." "Really? Say what you came to say, Robert." The mask of filial concern slipped slightly. "Fine. I know about the investments. I know about the safety deposit box in Des Moines, about the money Mum and Dad apparently hid from everyone. They didn't hide it from me. They left it for me. Left it for you or left it for the family." Robert stepped closer, close enough that Duke's growl rose in pitch. "I'm their grandson, their heir, as much as you are. Patricia, Michael, we all have a claim to whatever they left behind." Matthew studied his son, seeing clearly perhaps for the first time the man Robert had become. Not the boy he'd raised, not the young man he'd sacrificed for. This was a stranger wearing his son's face, someone who had learned to see love as leverage and family as a resource to be exploited. "You have a claim," Matthew repeated slowly, "to money your grandparents saved and invested and specifically left to me, to assets you didn't know about, never contributed to, never had any reason to expect. The law says it's mine." Matthew's voice was quiet, but carried an edge that made Robert take a half step back. "I've talked to lawyers too, son. Everything your grandparents left is legally mine to do with as I choose, and I choose not to share it with someone who stole my farm, destroyed my retirement, and left me and your mother to die in a church parking lot. That's not fair. The investments failed. I was trying to help." "You were trying to help yourself." Matthew felt Duke pressing against his leg, the dog's body vibrating with restrained aggression. "You saw two old people with assets you wanted, and you took them. You didn't care what happened to us afterward." Robert's face hardened, the pretense of concern finally abandoned entirely. "You can't prove I did anything illegal. The investments were legitimate, the risks were disclosed. I'm not interested in proving anything, Robert. I'm not interested in courts or lawyers or fighting over money." Matthew gestured at the land around them, at the Quonset, rising from its foundation of decades-old preparation. "I'm interested in building something, in living whatever years I have left, with dignity and purpose. You can't take that from me. We'll see about that." Robert turned back toward his car, then stopped. "You know, I tried to help you. The nursing home was a good facility. You would have been comfortable there." "Comfortable?" Matthew tasted the word like something bitter. "You wanted us comfortable and out of the way. You wanted to visit twice a year and feel good about yourself for putting your parents somewhere clean, and instead you're living in a barn. I'm living on land my father prepared for me, surrounded by love he stored up over a lifetime. I'm living with your mother and this dog who's shown me more loyalty than you ever did." Matthew met his son's eyes. "I'd rather live in this barn than in any palace you might build, Robert, because at least here I know who I am and what I'm worth." Robert left without another word, his sedan kicking up dust as it retreated down the access road. Matthew watched until it disappeared onto the main highway, then sat down heavily on the Quonset's front step. Duke immediately climbed into his lap, all 70 pounds of him, and pressed his face against Matthew's chest. "You're too big for this," Matthew said. But he wrapped his arms around the dog anyway and held on. Olivia found them like that 20 minutes later, returning from a walk along the creek with a basket of wild herbs she'd been collecting. "Robert came," she said. "It wasn't a question. He came. He made his threats. He left." She sat down beside him, setting her basket aside. Duke shifted to distribute his weight between them, his tail thumping against the wooden step. "Are you all right?" Matthew considered the question seriously before answering. "I think I am. I thought seeing him would hurt more than it did, but mostly, I just felt tired. Tired of pretending that what happened was anything other than betrayal. It was betrayal. It's okay to call it what it is. I know. He struggled to find words. "I spent so many years making excuses for them. Robert was just trying to help. He didn't understand the risks. Patricia was busy with her own life. She couldn't be expected to drop everything. Michael was always the fragile one. We couldn't put pressure on him." Olivia nodded slowly. "We taught them that. We taught them that their needs mattered more than ours, that our job was to sacrifice and theirs was to receive. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised when they believed us. It was the most honest assessment either of them had offered, of where things had gone wrong. Not just Robert's scheming or Patricia's coldness or Michael's absence, but the patterns that had been laid down over decades. The family dynamics that had somehow convinced their children that parents existed to be used. "We can't change the past," Matthew said, finally. "We can only decide what happens next." And what happens next? Matthew looked at the Quonset, at the land stretching around them, at the dog whose loyalty had never wavered. "We build something worth building. We live well, and we figure out how to make sure this," he gestured at everything around them, "means something beyond just us." Duke barked once, as if in agreement, and Olivia laughed, the first real laugh Matthew had heard from her in months. "Well," she said, "if Duke approves, who are we to argue?" Robert filed a claim, alleging that Edgar Marsh's assets were part of a family trust that should be divided among all descendants. Patricia added her name to the filing. Michael characteristically declined to participate either way. Tom handled the defense with the calm efficiency of someone who had anticipated every move. The claim was baseless. Edgar's will had been clear. His investments had been solely in his name, and the property on Mill Creek Road had been purchased with his personal funds decades before any of his grandchildren were born. "They're hoping you'll settle just to make the problem go away," Tom explained during one of their meetings. "They don't have a legal leg to stand on, but legal battles are expensive and exhausting. They're betting you'll pay them something just to avoid the hassle." "I won't. I know, but I wanted you to understand the strategy." The case was dismissed within 6 weeks, but not before it had consumed time, energy, and more than a little of Matthew's peace. Every legal document that arrived felt like an attack. Every phone call from Tom's office a potential crisis. Through it all, Duke remained Matthew's anchor. The dog seemed to sense when the stress was becoming too much, appearing at Matthew's side with a tennis ball, or simply pressing his warm body against Matthew's legs until the tension eased. "That dog is better than any therapist," Tom observed during one visit to the property. "Have you considered that he might actually be magic?" Matthew smiled, scratching behind Duke's ears. "I stopped questioning what Duke knows and doesn't know a long time ago. Whatever he is, I'm grateful for him." By midsummer, the transformation of Mill Creek Road was impossible to ignore. The Quonset, once a rusting eyesore, now stood proud with fresh paint and functional systems. Solar panels gleamed on its curved roof, an investment Matthew had made with a portion of his inheritance, providing power independence that felt like security. A proper bathroom had been installed, a small addition built onto the Quonset side, with plumbing connected to a well that Duke had somehow led Matthew to discover. The land itself was unrecognizable. Gardens flourished where weeds had choked. Fruit trees planted as saplings in April showed signs of healthy growth. The creek had been cleared of debris, its banks stabilized, its water running clean and cold, and people had begun to notice. Oliver Jensen visited regularly now, bringing supplies and leaving with vegetables from Olivia's garden. Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church came to see how his former parking lot residents were faring and left visibly moved by what they'd accomplished. Neighbors who had avoided the marshes during their months of poverty now stopped by with offers of help and invitations to community events. "Funny how that works," Olivia observed one evening as they sat on the porch Matthew had built, watching Duke chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "When we had nothing, no one wanted to know us. Now that we're doing well, everyone's our friend again. Are you angry about that?" She considered the question. "I was for a while, but I realized that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to get sick. Most of these people weren't being cruel. They just didn't know how to help, so they stayed away. That's human nature." Oliver didn't stay away. "No." She smiled. "Oliver saw something in you that reminded him of who you used to be, and he decided that was worth supporting. That's friendship. The rest of it is just community. People doing what people do." Matthew nodded slowly. His wife had always been wiser than him about matters of the heart. "So what do we do? Just forgive everyone and move on?" "We don't have to forgive anything. We just have to decide what kind of people we want to be." She reached over and took his hand. "I'd rather be the kind of people who build than the kind who keep score." Duke, having lost interest in the fireflies, trotted back to the porch and flopped down at their feet. His fur was damp from dew, his tongue hanging happily from his mouth. "I think Duke agrees with you," Matthew said. "Duke is a very wise dog." As if in acknowledgement, Duke's tail swept across the wooden boards. Once, twice, 3 times, before settling into stillness. The fireflies continued their silent dance across the meadow, and the creek sang its quiet song, and Matthew and Olivia Marsh sat on the porch of a home they'd built from nothing and everything, watching the night arrive. The first autumn on Mill Creek Road arrived with a gentleness that felt like forgiveness. Matthew stood at the edge of the property where his father had once stood, watching leaves drift from the oak trees in shades of gold and rust. The air carried the smell of wood smoke from the Quonset's new chimney, of apples ripening in the small orchard they'd planted, of earth preparing for winter's rest. Behind him, The farm all tractor sat in the morning light, its restoration finally complete. It had taken Matthew most of the summer, working in the cool hours of early morning and late evening, learning the machine's secrets the way his father must have learned them 70 years before. Every bolt he turned, every gasket he replaced, every adjustment he made felt like a conversation across time. Edgar teaching his son one final lesson in patience and persistence. The engine had turned over for the first time in September, coughing and sputtering before settling into a rhythm that Matthew felt in his bones. He'd sat in the driver's seat for nearly an hour that day, not going anywhere, just listening to the sound of something broken becoming whole again. Duke had sat beside the tractor the entire time, his tail sweeping the ground in slow, satisfied arcs. Now, as October painted the world in harvest colors, Matthew felt something he hadn't expected to feel again. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. That seemed too simple a word for the complex weave of grief and gratitude that filled his days. But contentment, yes. The deep satisfaction of work completed, of purpose fulfilled, of a life that still had meaning. "Your wool gathering again," Olivia's voice carried across the clearing, warm with affection. She walked toward him slowly, her gait steadier than it had been in years. The mountain air, or whatever healing property the land possessed, had continued its quiet work on her lungs. She rarely coughed anymore, rarely paused for breath on their walks along the creek. "Just thinking about Dad," Matthew said as she reached his side, wondering what he'd make of all this. He'd be proud. Olivia slipped her hand into his. He'd probably also find something to criticize. That fence post isn't quite straight. The garden rose could be neater. The Quonset needs another coat of paint. Matthew laughed, recognizing the truth in her words. Edgar Marsh had been a man of high standards, quick to notice imperfection, but beneath the criticism had always been love. A love that expressed itself through expectation, through the belief that his son was capable of excellence. "I found something yesterday," Olivia continued. "In the cellar, behind some of the canning supplies. I think Duke led me to it, actually." "What kind of something? Come see." The cellar had become Olivia's domain over the months, organized with the same meticulous care she'd once applied to their farmhouse kitchen. Shelves lined with preserved vegetables from her garden, root crops stored in sand, herbs hanging from the ceiling beams to dry. It smelled of earth and growing things, of life stored up against winter's coming. Duke descended the stairs ahead of them, his nails clicking on concrete, and led them to the far corner where the industrial shelving met the wall. Behind a row of mason jars filled with pickled beets, barely visible in the dim light, was a small wooden box. Matthew had somehow missed in all his explorations. "I only found it because Duke kept pawing at the jars," Olivia explained. "I thought he was after a mouse, but he was very specific about this spot." The box was perhaps 6-inch square, made of cedar that had protected its contents from moisture and time. Matthew lifted it carefully, noting its weight, and carried it up the stairs to the light. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were 2 items: a woman's ring, set with a small diamond, and a folded piece of paper. Matthew recognized the ring immediately. It had belonged to his grandmother, Edgar's mother, a woman who had died before Matthew was born, but whose photograph had hung in their farmhouse for as long as he could remember. The paper, when he unfolded it, contained his father's handwriting. "This ring belonged to my mother. She wore it every day of her married life, and asked that it be passed to someone who understood what marriage really means. Not the ceremony or the legal papers, but the choice to stay when staying is hard. I never gave it to your mother, because she already had her own mother's ring, and this one was meant to wait for the right moment. If you've found this, you found the rest of what I left behind. You've done the hard work of discovery. You've proven that you don't give up. Give this ring to Libby. She's earned it. So have you." Matthew's hands trembled as he held the ring up to the light. The diamond was small but clear, catching the autumn sun and scattering it into tiny rainbows. "Your grandmother's ring," Olivia whispered. He saved it all this time for you. Matthew turned to face his wife. He saved it for you. Olivia's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. Acknowledgement of a love that had been watching over them longer than they knew. "May I?" Matthew asked, gesturing to her left hand, where her original wedding ring still sat thin and worn from 62 years of daily wear. Olivia nodded. Unable to speak, Matthew slid his grandmother's ring onto Olivia's finger, where it settled beside the original band, as if it had always belonged there. The two rings together, one from 1962, one from perhaps the 1920s, represented a chain of love stretching back through generations. "I, Matthew Marsh," he said softly, "take you, Olivia Marsh, to be my wife again." Still, always laughed through her tears. "We're already married, you old fool." "I know, but I wanted to say it anyway." He kissed her forehead gently. "I wanted you to know that if I had to do it all over again, every struggle, every loss, every moment of the last 62 years, I'd choose you without hesitation. I'd choose this life. I'd choose us." Duke, who had been watching from the cellar stairs, padded over and pressed himself against both their legs, completing the circle. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October, carried by a postal worker who had to navigate the now well-maintained driveway to reach their mailbox. Matthew recognized the handwriting immediately. Michael, their youngest son. He almost threw it away unopened. The legal battle with Robert and Patricia had ended months ago, but the wounds remained fresh. Every communication from his children felt like a potential attack, another attempt to take what they hadn't earned, but something made him pause. Michael had never joined the lawsuit. Michael had sent that single card with the inadequate check, but he'd also stayed out of Robert's schemes. Matthew opened the letter. "Dad, I don't expect you to read this. I wouldn't blame you if you burned it without looking, but I needed to write it anyway, even if you never see these words. I'm sorry, not the kind of sorry that expects forgiveness or asks for anything in return. Just sorry for not being there, for not standing up to Robert when I should have, for letting fear and weakness keep me from doing what was right. I was always the one who avoided conflict. You know that when Robert started talking about the investments, about helping you optimize your assets, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it. But I didn't say anything, because saying something would have meant a fight, and I've spent my whole life avoiding fights. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth. I heard about what you've built on the Mill Creek property. Oliver Jensen's daughter works with my wife, and she's been talking about the transformation. How you took something everyone laughed at and turned it into something real. She says people in Cedar Falls are starting to call it the Marsh Place, like they used to call the farm. I'm proud of you, Dad. I know I have no right to be, but I am. I'm not asking to visit. I'm not asking for money or forgiveness or a place in your life. I just wanted you to know that not all of your children forgot what you taught us. Some of us just weren't strong enough to live up to it. I love you and Mum. I always have, even when I was too weak to show it, Michael. Matthew read the letter 3 times before setting it on the kitchen table. Duke, who had been dozing in a patch of sunlight, raised his head and studied him with those knowing amber eyes. What do you think, boy? Is he sincere? Duke rose, stretched, and walked to where the letter sat. He sniffed it carefully, then looked back at Matthew and wagged his tail once slowly, thoughtfully. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement, but it wasn't a rejection either. Matthew didn't respond to Michael's letter immediately. He needed time to sit with it, to examine his own heart for the truth of what he felt. The anger toward his children had become a familiar companion over the months, a fire that warmed him on cold nights, but also consumed energy he might have used for other things. Could he let it go? Should he? He talked to Olivia about it. Of course, they talked about everything now, their conversations longer and more honest than they'd been in years, as if their exile from normal life had stripped away the polite fictions that accumulate in long marriages. Michael was always different, Olivia said one evening as they sat by the Quonset's wood stove. Duke stretched between them like a furry bridge, more sensitive, more afraid. That doesn't excuse what he didn't do. No, but it might explain it. She was quiet for a moment, watching the fire through the stove's glass door. When Robert was planning everything, Michael probably saw it happening and felt powerless to stop it. He spent his whole life feeling powerless. Whose fault is that? The question hung between them, uncomfortable and necessary. Maybe ours partly, Olivia admitted. We protected him too much. We fought his battles because he seemed too fragile to fight them himself. And then we wondered why he never learned to stand up. Matthew thought about this, about Michael as a child, small and worried, always hovering at the edges of family gatherings, about the way they'd softened every blow, smoothed every obstacle, given him a cushioned path through life that had left him unprepared for its hardness. Robert's sins are Robert's own, he said finally. But Michael's weakness, maybe we helped create that. Does that mean you'll write back? I don't know yet. He reached down to rest his hand on Duke's warm flank. I need to think about what I'd even say. Before we continue to the end of Matthew and Olivia's story, I want to thank you for staying with me this long. Stories about ordinary people choosing to keep going, they matter. If you've found something meaningful here, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes, the right story at the right time can change everything. The first snow fell in early November, a light dusting that transformed Mill Creek Road into a scene from a Christmas card. Matthew stood on the Quonset's porch. Yes, it had a proper porch now, built from lumber he'd milled himself from fallen trees on the property, and watched the flakes drift down like blessings. Duke sat beside him, his muzzle raised to catch snowflakes on his tongue, looking for all the world like a puppy instead of an 11-year-old dog with grey in his fur and wisdom in his eyes. First winter here, Matthew said. Think we're ready? In response, Duke stood and trotted to the edge of the porch, where he looked back at Matthew with an expression of clear invitation. The dog had something to show him again. Lead the way, boy. They walked through the light snow to the workshop Matthew had created in one corner of the Quonset, the space where he'd restored the farm all, where tools hung in careful order on pegboard walls, where the smell of motor oil and sawdust created an atmosphere of productive purpose. Duke led him to a workbench where Matthew had been organizing his father's old tools, the ones that had come with the property. The dog pawed at a wooden box Matthew had set aside weeks ago, intending to examine it later, and then forgetting this one. Duke sat back on his haunches, watching expectantly. The box was unremarkable, just another of the many containers Edgar had used to store and protect his provisions. But when Matthew opened it, he found something that made his breath catch. Letters. Dozens of them tied with twine that crumbled at his touch. And not just any letters. Correspondence between his parents dating back to before their marriage, continuing through the years of Matthew's childhood, ending only with his mother's death in 1992. He sat down heavily on a shop stool, the weight of the discovery pressing on his chest. His parents had written to each other, even when they lived in the same house, even when they saw each other every day. They had maintained a correspondence that documented their thoughts, their dreams, their struggles, their love. Matthew picked up a letter at random, dated 1955. My darling Edgar, Matthew asked me today why you work so hard. I told him that his father is building something, not just the farm, but a future. He didn't understand, of course. He's only 8, but someday he will. I watch you sometimes when you don't know I'm looking. The way you study the horizon, the way you plan for contingencies no one else can see. I know the war changed you. I know you carry fears you'll never speak aloud, but I want you to know that I'm not afraid. Whatever you're preparing for, whatever you think might happen, I trust you. I trust your judgment, your vision, your love. We'll face it together, my love, whatever comes. Yours always, Ruth. Matthew's vision blurred, his mother's voice speaking to him across decades. explaining his father in ways Edgar himself never could. He read letter after letter as the snow continued to fall outside. The story of his parents' marriage emerged from the pages, not the silent, practical partnership he'd observed as a child, but a deep and abiding love that had expressed itself in private moments, in words meant only for each other. Edgar's letters revealed a man Matthew had never known, a man who worried constantly about providing for his family, who saw threats in every economic downturn and prepared accordingly. A man who loved his wife with a fierce, protective devotion that showed itself in everything he built and saved and planned. "I'm not doing this because I expect disaster," Edgar had written in 1962. "I'm doing this because I can't bear the thought of you or Matthew ever being helpless. If I can build a safety net strong enough to catch you, then whatever happens to me doesn't matter. You'll be protected. That's all I've ever wanted." Matthew wept, then openly, without shame, letting 60 years of misunderstanding wash away in tears. His father hadn't been cold or distant. His father had been terrified, and that terror had expressed itself in the only language Edgar knew: preparation, provision, protection. Duke pressed against his legs, offering the wordless comfort that only a dog can provide. "He loved us," Matthew whispered. "He just didn't know how to say it." That night, Matthew read some of the letters to Olivia. They sat together in the living space they'd created, comfortable now with real furniture they'd acquired over the months, with photographs on the walls and rugs on the floor, and all the small touches that transform a shelter into a home. "They had a whole relationship we never saw," Olivia said when he finished all those years, and they were writing love letters to each other. "I thought Dad was just practical, emotionless almost, but he was feeling everything. He just couldn't let it show. Some men are like that, their generation especially." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "Matthew, I think you need to write to Michael." The change of subject surprised him. "Why?" "Because you've spent months being angry at your children for not understanding you, for not seeing the love behind your actions, the sacrifice behind your choices." She gestured at the letters spread across the table. "But now you know your father spent his whole life doing the same thing, loving you in ways you couldn't see, protecting you through means you didn't understand." Matthew started to protest, then stopped. She was right. Of course she was right. "I'm not saying forgive everything," Olivia continued. "Robert did real harm intentionally. Patricia chose coldness when she could have chosen kindness. But Michael," she shook her head, "Michael just wasn't strong enough. And maybe part of that is our fault." Duke, who had been sleeping by the stove, lifted his head and looked at Matthew with those ancient knowing eyes. Even the dog seemed to be waiting for his decision. "What would I even say?" "The truth. That you received his letter. That you're not ready to pretend everything is fine, but you're not ready to close the door forever either. That you're still his father even when you're angry." Olivia took his hand. "That love doesn't disappear just because it's wounded." Matthew looked at the letters from his parents, evidence of a love that had expressed itself imperfectly, that had hidden behind practicality and provision, but that had been real nonetheless. He had spent his life not fully seeing his father. Did he want Michael to spend his life not fully seeing him? "I'll write tomorrow," he said. The letter to Michael was the hardest thing Matthew had written in his life. He went through a dozen drafts, each one feeling either too harsh or too soft, too wounded or too forgiving. Duke lay at his feet through every attempt, occasionally looking up as if reviewing the work and finding it inadequate. Finally, Matthew stopped trying to craft the perfect message and simply wrote what was true. "Michael, I received your letter. Thank you for sending it. I'm not going to pretend that everything is fine between us, because it isn't. What happened, what Robert did, what Patricia supported, what you didn't stop, caused real harm. Your mother and I almost died. That's not an exaggeration. We were left with nothing in the coldest months of the year, at an age when most people should be comfortable and secure. I'm also not going to pretend that I'm blameless. Your mother and I have talked about this. about how we raised your children, about the patterns we created without realizing it. Maybe we taught you that our role was to sacrifice, and yours was to receive. Maybe we made it too easy for you to see us as resources instead of people. None of that excuses what happened, but it might explain some of it. I'm writing because I don't want to be the kind of man who closes doors forever. I learned recently that my father loved me in ways I never recognized, that he spent his whole life preparing for the day I might need saving, and I never understood until he was long gone. I don't want that to happen with us. I don't want you to spend the rest of your life wondering whether I loved you, or whether I forgave you, or whether there was ever a chance to make things right. Here's where we are. I love you because you're my son and nothing can change that. But I don't trust you, and trust can only be rebuilt through action, not words. If you want to be part of our lives again, you'll have to earn that place slowly, carefully, without expectation. Your mother and I have built something good here on Mill Creek Road. We've created a home from what everyone said was worthless. We've found a kind of peace we didn't know we were missing. I don't know if there's room in that peace for you, but I'm willing to find out if you're willing to do the work. Your father, he mailed the letter before he could change his mind. Winter settled over Mill Creek Road with a gentleness that seemed almost intentional. Snow fell regularly, blanketing the property in white, but the Quonset held its heat, and the wood stove kept them warm. Duke, who had once been a working farm dog, spent his days dozing by the fire and his nights pressed against the foot of their bed, a living hot water bottle that snored. Matthew continued his work through the cold months, smaller projects now, repairs and refinements that kept his hands busy and his mind clear. He built a proper chicken coop from salvaged materials and acquired 6 hens from Oliver Jensen, who seemed to find endless reasons to visit. He expanded the root cellar's storage capacity and organized his father's tools into a system that would have made Edgar proud. Olivia filled the spaces between tasks with the domestic arts she'd always loved. The Quonset smelled constantly of baking bread, of simmering soups, of the herbs she dried and the preserves she put up. She knitted blankets from wool she'd found in the cellar, their patterns simple but warm. They talked more than they had in years, about their lives, their regrets, their hopes for whatever time remained, about their children. Not the wounded recriminations that had consumed the first months, but honest assessments of where things had gone wrong and why. I think we expected them to learn gratitude by osmosis, Olivia observed one evening. We modeled sacrifice, but we never taught them that sacrifice was supposed to be reciprocal. We wanted to give them everything we didn't have, and in doing so, we made them think having was the same as earning. She shook her head. No wonder they saw us as a resource. We trained them too. It wasn't comfortable, these conversations, but it was necessary. And somehow, in the honesty, Matthew found a peace he hadn't expected. Not absolution from his children's choices. Those remained their own, but release from the constant need to assign blame. Michael's response came in February, a short letter that contained more action than words. He had begun volunteering at a food bank in his city. He wrote he was learning what it meant to give without expectation. He wasn't asking for anything, just wanted his father to know. Matthew wrote back a brief note acknowledging the letter, encouraging the work, nothing more. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a door cracked open, a possibility maintained. Spring returned to Mill Creek Road with an explosion of green that made the previous year's careful planting look like prophecy fulfilled. Matthew stood at the edge of the property, his property, bought with the last money he had and transformed into something beautiful, and watched robins pull worms from soil he'd amended with compost and hope. The fruit trees wore clouds of white blossoms. The garden beds Olivia had prepared stood ready for planting. The Quonset, its rust long since addressed, gleamed in the morning light, like something that had always belonged here. Duke sat beside him, greyer than he'd been a year ago, but no less alert. The dog had slowed some over the winter. More naps, shorter walks, a stiffness in his hips on cold mornings, but his eyes remained bright, his devotion unchanged. his mysterious ability to find hidden things undiminished. "We did it, boy," Matthew said. "We actually did it." Duke's tail swept the ground slowly, acknowledgement and agreement in one gesture. Olivia appeared on the Quonset's porch, shading her eyes against the sun. "Oliver's coming up the drive. Looks like he's got something in his truck." Matthew walked back to meet the feed store owner, who was indeed unloading boxes from his pickup. Duke followed, investigating each box with his customary thoroughness. "Brought some seed potatoes," Oliver explained. "And my wife made jam," she insisted. "I deliver in person. Says it's not proper to let neighbors go without homemade jam." Neighbors. Matthew tasted the word. A year ago, the people of Cedar Falls had laughed at him for buying a rusted Quonset and 3 acres of weeds. Now the same people called him neighbor, stopped by with gifts, asked his advice about gardening and equipment repair. "That's what you are," Oliver said simply. "Marshes have been part of this community for 100 years. That didn't stop being true just because Robert tried to erase it." They stood together, 2 old men watching spring assert itself across the land. Duke had found a sunny spot and settled into it, his work of investigation complete. "You've built something good here, Matthew," Oliver said quietly. "Not just the property. You and Libby, you've built a good life. People noticed that we had help. You had a foundation." Oliver nodded toward the Quonset. "Your father left you more than money and equipment. He left you the belief that starting over was possible." He paused. "Most people, when they get knocked down as hard as you did, they stay down. You didn't. That's not luck, that's character." After Oliver left, Matthew found himself thinking about his father again, about the careful preparations Edgar had made, the safety net he'd woven from savings and secrecy and hope, about the letters to Ruth that revealed a heart no one had been allowed to see. Edgar Marsh had believed that providing for his family meant preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. He'd never learned to show love through presence, through words, through the simple act of being available, but he'd shown it through provision, through planning, through a legacy that had waited 70 years to be needed. Matthew understood now. He'd spent his own life showing love through sacrifice, through work, through giving his children every opportunity he'd never had, and like his father, he'd somehow failed to teach them that love was supposed to flow both ways. But that failure didn't erase the love, it just made it harder to see. The letter Matthew wrote that evening was to no one in particular, or maybe to everyone. He sat at the table. Olivia had salvaged from a barn sale and refinished with her own hands, with Duke at his feet, and the sounds of spring filtering through the open windows, and he wrote down everything he'd learned. "What I know now that I didn't know a year ago, that starting over is possible at any age, but it requires letting go of what you thought your life was supposed to be. That the people who love you sometimes express it in ways you can't recognize until much later. That forgiveness isn't about pretending hurt didn't happen. It's about deciding that the hurt won't be the only thing that defines your relationships. That a dog can teach you more about loyalty than most humans ever will. That home isn't a place you find. It's a place you build, one decision at a time, one day at a time, one act of faith at a time. That the land provides for those who don't give up on it." He set down the pen and looked around the space he and Olivia had created. At the wood stove that kept them warm, the shelves lined with preserved food, the photographs that documented a lifetime together. At Duke, sleeping now, his breath slow and steady. At Olivia, reading in her chair by the window, wearing his grandmother's ring beside her own wedding band, her face peaceful in the evening light. This was home, not because the walls were sturdy, or the land was productive, or the bank account was full, but because they had chosen it, because they had worked for it, because they had refused to give up when giving up would have been so much easier. Matthew folded the letter and placed it in the wooden box with his parents' correspondence. Someday someone might find it and understand what this place had meant. Or maybe no one would, and that was fine too. The meaning wasn't in being discovered, it was in the living. He stood crossed to Olivia's chair and leaned down to kiss the top of her head. "What was that for?" she asked, looking up with a smile. for being here, for staying, for believing we could build something when everyone else said we couldn't. We did build something. She took his hand and held it against her cheek. We built a life worth living. Outside the last light of day painted the Quonset in shades of gold and amber. The land stretched around them, green and growing, full of the promise that spring always carries. And Duke, waking from his nap, padded over to press against both their legs, completing the circle that had held them together through everything. They were home. Not because they had no other choice, but because they had chosen this, chosen each other, chosen this land, chosen to keep building, even when the world told them they were finished. The Quonset that everyone had laughed at stood solid and proud against the evening sky. The 3 acres that nobody wanted bloomed with life. And Matthew and Olivia Marsh, who had been betrayed and abandoned and left with nothing, had proven that nothing was sometimes enough. If you had the right person beside you, if you had work worth doing, if you had a good dog to show you what you couldn't see on your own, if you refused, absolutely refused to give